Some time ago I was counting the days since it all began, the beginning of the end. A virus. That's what they said in all the media at the time. It doesn't matter to me anymore, the world is not the same anymore. The rules have changed and I've made up my own. I'm not a good trainer, I only gave Nate basic commands. Maybe it's because I didn't work harder at it that I blame myself. The putrid stench invading my nostrils almost made me vomit as I descended into the total darkness of a subway tunnel. I stopped on the steps of the broken escalator, peering into the abyss below with apprehension. This was suicide, breaking all my hard-won rules of survival. But I had no choice. The once human, now demonic creatures had dragged my loyal companion Nate into their lair. Holding my flashlight, I took one last deep breath of fresh air before plunging into the darkness. The bones of those trampled in the panicked exodus years ago crackled under my boots with every cautious step I took. Nate and I have been together since the first days of Doomsday, which unleashed horrors across the streets of cities around the world. Once busy streets are empty, apartment doors and houses ripped off, broken or even missing. I always wanted a faithful companion. I dreamed of having time to devote to him and just enjoy a day in the park. What a joke. Before this shit happened I didn't even have time for myself. You know that cliché about starting a family? So that was in the back of my mind and now I don't even know if I'll have that one day. On the 6th day after the Holocaust, I found a German Shepherd puppy whimpering in a blood-soaked apartment and since then we've survived as a team. But that day one of those damn bizarre creatures grabbed Nate, probably to turn him into a tracking beast like them. The image of its thin limbs disappearing with my friend into the State Street subway entrance haunted me. I knew the horrendous torture Nate would face if I didn't act. He's my family, now I know what it's like to have one, and I wasn't going to leave him behind. The faint echo of my footsteps mingled with the blind movement of the horrifying creatures in the shadows of that oppressive tunnel that seemed to suck my hope away with every minute I passed through it. Everything was very dark down there, a perfect environment for the damned to make their nests. I had silently passed several of them, taking advantage of the fact that they couldn't see very well. Some still had rags of clothing stuck to them. After hours, I reached the platform. An inhuman, bone-chilling scream shattered the silence and I inevitably fell to the ground, the pulse exploding in my ears. Probably some kind of sound language they use to communicate, since once they are contaminated they lose the ability to speak. The creatures seemed busy with their food orgy. The wet tearing of flesh echoed along the path. Luckily it wasn't Nate. A few feet away, I found and entered an abandoned train carriage. I found nothing there but bones and dried bodily fluids while I heard chewing and muffled growls from both sides of them tearing their victims apart. I climbed out of that wagon through an opening at the end of it and focused ahead, crawling over scattered pieces of the dead. I passed a severed arm still holding a telephone, which I'm sure was one last desperate call for help from that individual. I finally found my faithful companion, but in a vision of hell itself. The creature that had kidnapped him was there, a male stronger than the rest, perhaps the leader of a group of them. Surrounded by mutilated bodies and other creatures feeding, he crouched over Nate, who didn't react because he was wounded and unconscious. I was waiting for the perfect moment for a possible kamikaze attack on my part until I thought of using the scenario to my advantage. I picked up a skull and threw it in the opposite direction. Everyone but the leader didn't go. He was cunning, but I'm much more so. Serving in the U.S. Army for 12 years had helped me survive this far and was my advantage at that point. So I slid the knife from my belt and crawled onto the leader's back, covering his mouth as my blade pierced his brain. By some miracle, the other creatures were still looking for the source of the distracting sound, while I picked Nate up in my arms. We passed the corpse of a small child with white, lifeless eyes. It touched me because I had never entered the creature's lair to witness the horror up close. I remained firm and cautious on the way back. Any mistake would kill us both in seconds, so I tied Nate to my back to have my hands free for a possible fight or desperate escape. I finally got out of that lair and walked up the escalator into the sunlight. These creatures have nocturnal habits, but that doesn't stop them from attacking someone during the day. At least there would be fewer of them if they followed me into the street. This all started when I went desperately to the pharmacy in that old shopping center in the hope of finding medical supplies, but before we could enter the store Nate and I heard a noise and then he separated from me. Ironically, later I would really need those medicines to treat my friend's wound. I didn't hesitate to pass by before returning to the street. So I ran into the pharmacy with the flashlight, browsing the ransacked and destroyed shelves until I found a bottle of antibiotics that I kept in my backpack. On the way out of the mall I looked for a safe place to medicate Nate because I didn't want to wait another second to save my best friend, my only companion. Everything that was left of me was in that dog. I quickly bandaged the wound after sterilizing it and stayed there for a few more hours with Nate on my lap, waiting for him to wake up and show the first signs of recovery. Well, at least that was my expectation after everything we had been through in that underground hell. I fell asleep and was woken up by Nate's spasms. He started with a cry, reminding me of the day I met him, until he changed to a growl with sounds reminiscent of the creatures. At the time I didn't know if the virus could be contracted by animals, and if so, whether they would mutate genetically. I'm sorry to say that I found this out the hard way. Nate woke up totally different, tried to attack me and in reflex I pushed him away. My best friend was staring at me like I was his lunch. He ran towards me and knocked me over, trying to bite me in the face and neck. As I stopped him, I pulled my gun out of its holster, put the barrel under his chin and said, "Forgive me for my mistakes, my friend." Then I pulled the trigger, crying with his blood on my hands. From that moment on, I was nothing. All I could think about was that my carelessness had cost my best friend his life. The sun was setting and the sound of the shot from my gun attracted thousands of creatures within a radius of hundreds of feet. I didn't want to go home anymore. I told myself that I should pay for my mistakes and stay there, spend my last moments by Nate's side. I had never cried so much in my life as I did at that moment, as I listened to the sound of the creatures coming from my flesh. I pointed the barrel of my gun at my chin just as I had done with Nate, closed my eyes and began to see my whole life flashing through my mind in a matter of seconds. Then that silence where the screams of the creatures echoed through the streets was taken over by the sound of the second shot. I opened my eyes and realized that I was still alive, or maybe I was going mad before I died. The shot came from another gun. But whose? If you want to know what happens next, leave a comment asking for part 2 of this story. See you in the next video, or not.